Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Actually, this is the first video that I've posted in almost 2 years. Crazy to think. I just didn't like where my channel was going, so I'm wiping it clean and I'm going to start focusing on things that I actually do love, like cozy aesthetics. I absolutely love reading, cozy gaming, and I do travel quite a bit. So I kind of just want to focus on this very cozy, quiet aesthetic. So with that being said, this video is all about my January reading wrap-up. I ended up reading 10 books in January, which is actually the best reading month that I've had in quite some time. I ended up reading 7 novels and 3 manga. So with that being said, before we get into the books that I read for the month, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on my video. And also make sure to follow me on my Instagram channel, A Sip of Cozy. That is where I post all of my bookish content. So the first book that I read for the month of January is Milo and Margaret at the End of the World. This book was sent to me by NetGalley and the publisher, so thank you to them. I ended up giving this book a 3 stars, and there is a reason for it. But pretty much the premise of the book is that Milo and Marcus are 2 teenagers who are in a religious family. They meet at a religious camp, they form a crush on each other, but they end up kind of going their own separate ways. When they finally see each other again in their senior year of high school, weird things start happening every time they're together. Milo starts to think that God is telling them that they can't be together, and thus sending all these natural disasters and creating an end of the world scenario. This book had a lot of promise, and I enjoyed a lot of the premise and this idea that we can be queer and also be religious. As somebody that comes from a religious background and is queer herself, I really liked that representation. However, with that being said, this book is listed as dystopian, and it did not come across that way. It came definitely across more as religious rather than dystopian, and the dystopian kind of just was playing in the background and was causing the reasons for the plot to happen. So I didn't enjoy that. Another big thing is that there is a lot of trigger warnings with this book. I struggled. The forefront of the book was very religious and focused a lot on inner homophobia, religious homophobia, as well as conversion therapy is mentioned. So if you are triggered for any of those things, I definitely recommend going into the book a little bit hesitant, especially the conversion therapy. That was a little bit hard-hitting, and for the book not to include those trigger warnings was a little bit no-no for me, especially when you're talking about such religious themes included with queer literature. It does come out May 24th, so it is a few months before it comes out. I definitely recommend checking it out. The next book that I read for January was Vesper by Margaret Rogerson. This is the first book that I've ever read by Margaret Rogerson. This was also sent to me by the Bookish Box. I am a rep for them, so definitely use my code COZY, C-O-Z-Y, to save on your next subscription. What Vesper is about is it follows a young woman named Artemisia, and she is a nun in a covenant. And what ends up happening is that a group of dead soldiers that are filled with spirits are coming and going to try to destroy her covenant, and she takes on the Revenant, which is a very powerful soul, into her body and uses his powers to destroy the army. She thus goes on this journey, becoming the Vespertine, which is a saint, and saving people's lives, as well as trying to find the person that is bringing these souls back to life. I really enjoyed this book. I love this idea of the different souls and the different levels of souls, and that if like a child dies, they aren't evil, they're wisps that are guiding people that are lost. I just found that idea really cool. I also like the idea of the Revenant, that there's these very powerful souls that can take over the body and kind of become alive themselves. That was really interesting to me. The plot was also really great. Where it fell flat for me was the characters themselves. I felt that Artemisia was more of a 2D character rather than a 3D character. She did not have any emotions. A lot of it comes from her past, but it almost came to the point where she was emotionless, and she felt like a dead soul herself, and I didn't really like that. I also wasn't a fan of the fact that here she is, a person that doesn't have any trust towards anyone, and when she takes on the Revenant within a few pages, she's very trusting of him, very open to him. And I'm a person that likes that relationship build. I like to see this enemies to friends build over pages rather than over a few pages. So that's why I ended up giving it a 3.75 stars. I felt like this book could be a standalone, but it's being set up as a duology or a trilogy. With the ending, I honestly think it could have just been a standalone, or the author could have extended this book and added in more plot that would have been relevant to this book. Then the next book that I read for January, which ended up being my only 5-star read for January, is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, or in the Mistborn world. I cannot believe that I let this book sit on my shelf for almost 6 years. I ended up buying this book when I lived in Norway, and I just let it sit there. I ended up transporting it back home when I moved back to the United States. So if you haven't picked up Mistborn, or if you've been putting it off, I highly recommend you picking it up. This takes place in a world where the Dark Lord, or the Lord Ruler, has won. The hero is killed, the Dark Ruler takes over, and he ends up enslaving a group that is called the Ska, and one of the characters, Kelsier, decides he's done with the repression that is given to them, and so he decides to make the biggest heist known to mankind to take down the Lord Ruler, and he brings in a bunch of different characters. The other main character, Vin, is brought in. She's a 16-year-old. She is a Mistborn, and a very powerful Mistborn at that. I loved everything about this book. I mean, as you can see with my annotating, I loved the character Vin. I loved the main character, Kelsier. I absolutely loved the ending of this book. I thought the world building was beautiful. I think the character developments for not only main characters, but for the side characters was absolutely wonderful. So if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It is one of my favorite reads, and it also made it up into my top 5 reads ever. The next manga that I read is Therapy Game Restart by Megura Hinohara. This is volume 1 of Therapy Game Restart. If you haven't read Therapy Game, you need to go read that. I can't really explain the premise of this one without explaining Therapy Game. So Therapy Game follows Shizuma and Minato in their journey of love. Shizuma ends up getting drunk and pretty much passing out on Minato as the things are about to get spicy, and Minato sets out to get his revenge on Shizuma. However, things don't work out, and Minato ends up falling in love with Shizuma. With that being said, Therapy Game Restart takes place after the events of Therapy Game. It's one of my favorite mangas out there when it comes to yaoi and BL manga, so definitely recommend it. I do pick up sometimes nonfiction, especially when I need a cleansed palate after something like The Final Empire. So I ended up reading Daily Rituals by Mason Curry. The idea of the book was good. So pretty much what he does is he creates all of the rituals that an artist does, such as Beethoven, Jane Austen, and a bunch of other artists, and tells us their daily ritual on how they're created. And while I enjoyed some of it, the takeaway was very negative for me. So his whole thing about the book was to be positive, and these authors inspire you to be creative, and that didn't happen for me. In fact, it was the complete opposite. Reading about these people's lives made them seem very negative. Jane Austen had to hide her work, and he talked more about the negative of Jane Austen rather than the positive. Beethoven would hide away from his wife and drink and not sleep. You had one author that literally had the most unhealthiest lifestyle. Actually, all of these authors had very unhealthy lifestyles, and he showed that. And so by the end of it, it didn't inspire me to be anything like any of these authors. My second issue with the book was only 9 female artists out of the 150 artists in the book. Not a fan of that. The other issue that I have is that out of the 150 some artists that he lists, only 6 of them are people of color. Since there are so many people of color artists, authors, writers, contemporary artists, so many of them, and yet he only picked 9 of them. So in the end, this book not only came off as very negative, but it also came off more so as white supremacy. I ended up giving this book a 2.75 stars. This is from the library. Thank God I didn't buy it because, oh my God, I couldn't be able to handle it. Then the next book was another book that ended up being a 2-star read, and I was just so disappointed with it. So here's a little background for you. I have an obsession with ancient Egypt. I have an obsession with ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient civilization. I even went so far as I have a full-blown tattoo sleeve of an ancient Egyptian civilization on my arm full of. So I am very much so into the Egyptian history, and I buy a lot of books that contain Egyptian history. And so I picked up from the library When Women Ruled the World by Cara Cooney, thinking that finally we're going to have female representation in historical context. And boy, was I wrong. So the whole point of this book was to write about the 6 women of Egypt and why they came into power and how they came into power, especially since in ancient Egypt, women didn't have as many rights as us still, yet there was women coming into power and ruling either beside their young sons or husbands or ruling by themselves in general. In the end, what I came out of this book is that Cara Cooney is not only a feminist, but she hates men, and she also brought in sexist content. So even though she would say these women are powerful, the reason why they were powerful and were put into positions of being a queen pharaoh was the fact that women rule better because they're softer, more nurturing, and tend to have a disposition against going to war. And I'm just like, where is the evidence? They live in one of the most gruesome times in history, and you're telling me that they are softer? I don't think so. She also brings a lot of modern day context into the books, and she even, for a feminist, uses some of Trump's slogans such as "Make Egypt Great Again," and that's another thing that I'm just not understanding as a feminist why she would have taken that approach. And then there's the lack of evidence in general. She makes a lot of bold claims about the historical context of these women and doesn't have any evidence to back it up. She also uses a lot of probably and maybe, but then still uses those probably and maybe statements as historical facts. I think that the issue with that is that it could later lead to somebody reading this book and taking this as historically accurate when that's not the case. She does give evidence to some of her statements, but for a majority of her bold statements, such as the fact that she says that the reason why some pharaoh men couldn't have children is because of incest, infertility, and because they were gay. And I don't even know where she came up with that. So I'm done with it. We're moving on. The next book that I read is This Woven Kingdom by Tahar and Mafi. This was also sent to me via NetGalley and the publisher, so thank you once again to them. This also was a book that I only rated 3 stars, so pretty much This Woven Kingdom follows a young woman named Elise, and Cameron, who is the crown prince, and it goes into this idea of jinn and these powerful jinn and how they gave up their power to be able to be closer to the power of humans, and this ended up leading the humans to pretty much enslave and or make them servants of humans. I really liked that premise of the jinn, and I liked the world build, and I really liked these different ideas that This Woven Kingdom brought in. With that being said, here are the issues with This Woven Kingdom and the reason why I ended up giving it a 3 stars. The plot. So the 400 and some pages that you read, only 3 days take place. So from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, the timeline of the book is only 3 days. So that means that there's so much going on and so much being rushed. And then the other issue is the insta-love. So keep in mind, once again, only 3 days have passed. That means that the characters fell in love within hours of meeting each other. I don't like it. I hate insta-love. It can go away. My other main issue is the fact that these characters, there was not much development to them. They were like any other YA character that I read. This book was not for me. I picked up another manga. This one is This Wonderful Season with You by Atsuko Yusen. So this follows Inoki as well as Shirataki. This was another book that I ended up giving a 3 stars. I wasn't a fan. I thought the idea of it was cute, but once again the premise felt flat. I love Tokyo Pop, but this wasn't my favorite of their boy love mangas that they have. Then the next book that I read is Ferryman by Claire Mcfaul. This was really interesting to me. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. This follows a young woman named Dylan. She ends up leaving school early to go and see her dad for the first time. Her dad hasn't been in her life at all. And on her way to seeing her dad, she ends up in a train accident that kills her, thus thrusting her into the afterlife. However, before she can be in her peaceful afterlife, she needs to get through the wasteland, and thus the ferryman gets involved. The ferryman is named Tristan. His goal is to guide the souls across the wasteland to get them to their afterlife. I really enjoyed this book. I loved Mcfaul's idea of the afterlife, especially since that is a question that humanity's been asking for thousands of years. What happens after we die? And she does such a really good job at reinventing this afterlife. The wasteland is really interesting to me because its own setting, the wasteland tends to be red skies, red dirt, very dark, very creepy. However, that is just the base of the wasteland, and it transforms based on the soul's preference. So for Dylan, it is a hilly landscape that she was seeing on her way to see her father. Was it good? Absolutely. Did I like it? Definitely. Will I read the next one? For sure. But I didn't like the characters, the 2D-ness of them. I didn't like the instant attraction that we were given, and I just didn't like the fact that the plot was very slow for 150 pages because all we did was watch these two characters walk across hills. And then the final manga that I read for the month of January, which it was a short one and it was fairly cute, was Sasaki and Miano by Haru Sono. Hopefully I said that correct. I thought that this was super cute. I think I ended up giving this 4 stars. I don't remember which one I gave it, but it was adorable. So what ended up happening was Sasaki ended up noticing that Miano's friend was being beaten up, and he steps in, takes care of him, and ends up having this weird friendship relationship with Miano. Miano is not really a fan of Sasaki in the sense of he just doesn't care, and he doesn't understand why Sasaki's around because Sasaki is a senpai, meaning he's an older classman, and Miano is a freshman. It also leads to Miano borrowing Sasaki BL manga and them two kind of bonding about BL manga, except the situation is that Sasaki likes and has a crush on Miano, and Miano is completely oblivious. I thought that it was super cute. I really enjoyed the characters. I wasn't a fan of the present to past transitions because there was times where I thought it was the past and it actually ended up being the present. But other than that, it was super cute. So with that being said, that is my January wrap-up. If you would like to see my February TBR, definitely let me know in the comments below. I will see you guys in my next video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye guys!